I didn't come
They
here to
mocked
play
her at
games.
Bootcamp until
I
the
am
commander
stronger
went
than
pale at
anything
the
you throw
tattoo
at
she
me.
tried to hide. The parade ground at Fort
You know the
Darrington
rules
carried
about
that sharp,
unauthorized ink,
metallic
Private.
morning
It's who
chill,
I
the
am.
kind that made
I
the
earned
air
it.
The only
feel
thing you
like a
earn
drill
here is
sergeant's
respect for the
judgment.
uniform. Hide
Recruits clustered near the pull-up
We're
bars,
compromised.
boots planted
Get
in
out of
loose
there.
gravel, half awake
need
and
30
half trying to look
seconds.
tougher
No,
than they
we're
felt.
out of time.
In the middle of
Move.
that restless formation stood a woman
Your
old enough
bearing
to be
is
most of
strong,
their
but
mothers.
secure that sleeve.
Gray-streaked
Don't
hair,
let me catch
tied
it
back
loose
tight,
again.
uniform
It won't
worn
happen
but
again,
spotless,
Sergeant Major.
posture straight as a firing line.
Call this a
She
fight.
didn't speak.
You're holding back.
She
You
didn't
want me to
even
go
look at
all
them.
out. You'll regret
She just
that.
adjusted the strap of her pack
Come
with
on
a
then.
quiet, deliberate
I'll
motion.
finish you.
One of
Get on
those
the mat
small,
right now,
exact
Marine.
gestures
Let's see
that
what
felt
you're
too
made of.
disciplined
Yes,
to belong
Sergeant.
to a
I'll
rookie.
show you.
Maybe that
I'm
was
ready
why they
too.
targeted her. A younger recruit stepped forward broad, confident,
Sir, reporting
wearing the
as
grin
ordered.
of someone who believed he
All
owned the whole
personnel
boot
present
camp.
and prepared for duty.
He hooked 2 fingers under her shoulder seam and yanked hard, stretching the fabric. "Strip off that uniform, faker," he said, loud enough for the whole platoon to hear. "This place isn't a senior fitness club." Laughter erupted. Boots scraped. Someone whistled. Someone else muttered, "Why'd they even let her in? Did she win a charity raffle?" The woman didn't flinch. She simply squared her stance and looked straight ahead, eyes steady, heartbeat invisible. It was as if the noise didn't register or didn't matter. That only made the crowd bolder. The young man tugged again, harder, trying to tear the sleeve clean off. That was when the fabric shifted, and something black curved across the pale skin of her shoulder. A few recruits stopped laughing. "Wait, what is that? A tattoo? Nah, looks fake." But it wasn't fake. It wasn't decorative. And even in that tiny glimpse, the shape was unmistakable. A coiled serpent forming a skull, ink dark enough to look burned in. She reached up calmly and resecured her sleeve, as if covering it was more about courtesy than embarrassment. The reactions around her shifted confusion more than mockery now, though pride kept the loud ones from backing off. Across the yard, the base commander was making his inspection rounds, boots thudding in precise rhythm, barking corrections at another squad. His gaze drifted toward the noise. The recruits snapped slightly straighter, pretending to be disciplined. The older woman didn't move at all. The commander began walking in their direction. The bully smirked, eager to show off, eager to prove he'd exposed a fraud. "Sir, we've got someone pretending she belongs here." The commander barely spared him a glance. His eyes went straight to the woman, then to the torn seam at her shoulder. She knew what was coming. She raised her chin, waiting. "Turn," he ordered. The recruits expected her to resist. Instead, she stepped forward with perfect precision, pivoted, and let the torn sleeve slip just enough for the morning light to catch the ink beneath. Silence collapsed over the entire yard, because the commander froze. Not confused, not irritated, frozen. His face drained of color, his eyes locked on the tattoo as if he were staring at a ghost, at something that should have never walked onto a training field again. A whisper broke from him, meant for no one and everyone at once. That mark. That unit was classified and dissolved 25 years ago. A ripple rolled through the formation. Someone swallowed hard. Someone actually took a step back. The bully's grin died instantly, replaced by a slow, dawning dread. The woman pulled her sleeve back into place, voice level, quiet, steady. "Sir, request permission to continue training." The commander didn't hesitate. His spine snapped straight, and he answered her with the tone soldiers, used only for legends, people whose stories were told behind closed doors, and stamped with ink that never saw daylight. Permission granted. For the first time that morning, the yard stood completely still. The recruits who mocked her realized they hadn't been picking on someone out of place. They had been provoking someone whose place had once been far beyond anything they could imagine. And none of them had the faintest idea what that tattoo truly meant. The recruits remained frozen in an uneasy semicircle while the commander steadied his breathing, trying to mask the shock that had shattered his composure the instant he recognized the tattoo, and the older woman simply adjusted her sleeve with the calm precision of someone who had endured far worse humiliation than a boot camp prank. No one dared speak as she stepped back into formation, but the silence itself felt heavier than any shouted order, stretching across the yard like a taut line, threatening to snap at the slightest misstep. The young bully who had taunted her stood rigid, his jaw clenched in a mix of fear and regret, because the commanding officer was now staring directly at him with a level of disappointment that cut deeper than anger and the rest of the unit sensed that the morning's power dynamic had shifted into something unfamiliar and dangerously fragile. The woman's expression didn't change, yet the quiet certainty in her posture suggested she knew this shift was inevitable, as though she had lived through countless similar moments where arrogance collapsed beneath the weight of truth. The commander took a deliberate step forward and inspected the formation with an intensity that made every recruit straighten their spine. And when his gaze returned to her, there was no longer even a trace of doubt, only a strange mixture of reverence and discomfort reserved for those who had once belonged to stories whispered in classified corridors. He asked for her name, but she responded with only her last initial, delivered in a measured tone that conveyed both respect and an unspoken boundary he instinctively chose not to cross. The recruits watched her closely now, noticing small details they had ignored earlier. The way she placed her feet with perfect alignment, the subtle readiness in her shoulders, and the calm vigilance in her eyes that suggested an ingrained instinct to scan every angle of the environment. Even the quietest among them felt the atmosphere change, sensing the presence of someone who had not only been trained but shaped by experiences far beyond the reach of standard military instruction. A few recruits shifted nervously, whispering theories about her past, though none dared speak loud enough for the commander to hear, because they all knew that classified units came with classified consequences, and mocking someone with that kind of background was a mistake that might follow them long after boot camp ended. The bully swallowed hard and attempted to steady his breathing, aware that the repercussions of his earlier arrogance were settling over him like an incoming storm he couldn't outrun. The commander finally addressed the unit, his voice firm but subdued, ordering them to resume their morning drills, though his eyes kept returning to the woman as if confirming she was truly there and not a remnant of a classified file he once reviewed in a dimly lit office. The formation obeyed, but the energy had shifted entirely, and even the sound of boots striking the pavement seemed hesitant, as though the recruits were afraid any misstep might draw her attention. Despite the tension, the woman ran her laps with the same steady rhythm she had demonstrated earlier, maintaining a pace that neither flaunted superiority nor exposed weakness, allowing the recruits to witness discipline molded not by ego, but by years of unspoken responsibility. Several younger trainees began subtly matching her tempo, hoping to learn something from her quiet mastery, though none dared run beside her out of fear of appearing presumptuous. As they transitioned into calisthenics, one of the drill instructors approached the commander and asked an unspoken question with a slight tilt of his head, prompting a curt response that confirmed only one thing. Whatever he recognized on her shoulder, it was never meant for boot camp eyes. The instructor nodded stiffly and returned to his duties, though he kept glancing in her direction with a level of cautious respect usually reserved for visiting officers. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the yard, and each shadow seemed to stretch toward her as though pulled by gravity, marking her presence as something that altered the very atmosphere around the unit. The bully tried to mimic confidence again, but his movements were stiff, and every time he caught her in his peripheral vision, he flinched slightly, haunted by the realization that he had tugged the sleeve of someone who once stood in places where soldiers rarely returned alive. The recruits continued their drills, but the woman completed every task with a composed precision that made even the instructors pause mid-step, and a few began to wonder whether her presence was part of an evaluation they hadn't been briefed on. She executed each movement flawlessly, yet never aggressively, embodying the quiet strength of someone who no longer sought recognition because she had already earned more than most people would ever understand. As the session neared its end, the commander called for a brief halt, using the pause to watch her with a distant expression that suggested he was remembering something buried in classified archives. And the recruits sensed there were pieces of her past none of them would ever be cleared to access. The older woman finally met his gaze without hesitation, and in that shared moment of recognition, the entire yard understood that the power imbalance had not only reversed, but settled firmly and permanently. The bully wanted to apologize, yet no words formed, because apologies felt absurdly small compared to the truth he had accidentally revealed, and the woman's silence made it clear she neither needed nor desired his remorse. She simply stood at attention, breathing steadily, her presence commanding more respect than any shouting instructor ever could, and the unit recognized instinctively that she was not a relic or an anomaly, but a soldier who carried a past etched too deeply into her soul to ever fade. When the commander finally dismissed them, the recruits dispersed slowly, unable to stop glancing back at her, each one grappling with the dawning realization that they had shared a training field with someone whose mere tattoo could turn the most seasoned officer pale. And though none of them fully understood the significance of the symbol she carried, they knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever story she held, it was far from ordinary, and they had only witnessed the opening line of a far deeper legend. The afternoon sun bore down on the training field with a relentless heat that clung to every surface. Yet the older woman moved through the obstacle course with a steadiness that seemed almost unnatural for someone her age. The recruits watched her navigate each challenge without a single wasted motion, noting how her hands found perfect grip positions and her feet landed with a precision that came only from experience forged under far harsher conditions. Even the drill instructors exchanged quiet glances, recognizing a level of control that didn't align with the file of an ordinary trainee, no matter how determined. The bully, desperate to reclaim the authority he had foolishly lost, lingered near the equipment racks with a simmering resentment that clouded his judgment, convincing himself that he only needed one moment of superiority to erase the humiliation. While the others focused on completing their runs, he subtly loosened the anchor strap on one of the climbing ropes, hoping she would be the next to use it and finally stumble in front of the watching platoon. It was a petty act born from bruised pride, but the danger it created was far more real than he understood. When her turn came, the woman reached the rope with the same calm assurance she carried through every part of the day, yet she paused for barely a heartbeat, her eyes narrowing as she noticed the faint shift in the rope's tension. Without acknowledging the mistake, she adjusted her stance and gripped the line in a way that compensated for the compromised knot, revealing an instinctive understanding of physics and risk that left the sabotage ineffective. She climbed with unbroken rhythm, her wrists turning with a practiced elegance that made the instructors silently reevaluate everything they assumed about her past. At the top of the tower, she scanned the horizon with a brief lift of her chin, as though confirming the perimeter out of reflex rather than necessity, before descending with precise, measured control. The recruits below watched in uneasy silence, realizing that even attempts to undermine her could not disrupt the quiet confidence she carried like an unseen shield. The bully felt his stomach twist as he realized she had detected his tampering without directly confronting him, and the knowledge settled on him like an invisible hand tightening around his throat. During the next drill, the platoon formed in pairs to practice defensive holds, but no one volunteered to partner with her, fearing both embarrassment and the unsettling potential of discovering just how skilled she truly was. An instructor finally assigned a partner for her, a tall, athletic trainee known for his competitive intensity, but even he hesitated before stepping forward, uncertain whether he was supposed to challenge her or simply survive the exercise. She gave him a short nod, offering no advantage and no threat, yet her composure alone made him acutely aware of every flaw in his stance. When the drill began, she moved with an efficiency that bordered on uncanny, slipping past his guard before he processed the shift, guiding his momentum into a controlled takedown that left him on the ground without pain, but with a profound sense of inferiority. She released him immediately, stepping back to reset, her expression unchanged, as though the sequence had been nothing more than a simple mechanical task. The recruits watching felt a flicker of awe ripple through the group, realizing she possessed a mastery that went beyond strength or speed, resting instead in the rare domain of perfect judgment. The commander observed from a distance, arms folded and eyes narrowed, studying the way she adapted to every challenge without hesitation, and the memories of classified briefings resurfaced with unsettling clarity. He recognized the hallmarks of operators who had survived missions deemed unwinnable, individuals trained to internalize danger so deeply that their movements became part of an instinctive language few could interpret. Though he said nothing, his posture revealed a subtle stiffness that only grew stronger each time she executed another flawless maneuver. As the drills intensified, the instructors pushed the recruits harder, yet the woman's performance remained remarkably consistent, revealing a stamina that contradicted every assumption about her age or background. Even when the inclined sprints left younger trainees gasping for breath, she maintained a steady cadence, her breathing controlled, her focus unwavering, and her presence gradually reshaped the rhythm of the entire platoon. Some recruits found themselves matching her pace unconsciously, while others avoided looking at her altogether, unsettled by a discipline they could neither replicate nor fully understand. The bully, increasingly unstable under the weight of his earlier mistakes, attempted another petty maneuver by blocking her path during a relay handoff, but she sidestepped him with a level of precision that made the motion seem pre-planned rather than reactive. Her expression remained neutral, yet something in her eyes conveyed a warning sharper than any spoken reprimand, reminding him that his attempts at dominance were both futile and dangerous. He fell behind the formation, breathing unevenly, haunted by the realization that he had picked a fight with a ghost he never should have awakened. Toward the end of the day, the platoon assembled for a final endurance test involving weighted carries across the training yard, and the instructors handed out the heavy packs, with a stern reminder that no one was permitted to quit. The woman accepted her pack with both hands, lifting it in a single smooth motion that suggested the weight was insignificant, though the strain it caused others was immediately obvious. As she stepped into position, the recruits noticed how she unconsciously checked her surroundings again, ensuring no hazards lingered, as though the field still held dangers from a different lifetime. When the whistle blew, she advanced with determined calm, her steps measured and her rhythm steady, her silhouette cutting through the dust like a figure from an old combat report rather than a current recruit. The sun dipped lower, lengthening the shadows, and in those shadows the platoon saw the outline of someone who had carried far heavier burdens than any training pack. Her performance, quiet yet immovable, became a gravitational force around which the entire yard slowly oriented itself, reshaping the recruit's perception of strength without a single spoken word from her mouth. By the time the exercise ended, the instructors exchanged looks that confirmed a shared belief. This woman was not merely surviving boot camp, but redefining it with every controlled breath and deliberate step. Even the commander's final call to assemble held an edge of caution, as though he understood that the story unfolding in front of him was far larger than the reports he had once read. The recruits stood at attention with a new awareness, understanding that the tension surrounding her was no longer simple curiosity, but the heavy, lingering sense that her presence carried a history none of them were prepared to witness. And though no one said it aloud, the entire platoon felt the same unspoken truth settling into the air like distant thunder. The events of the day were only the beginning, and whatever she once was, she had not yet revealed the full extent of her past, nor the reason she had returned to a place far beneath her true standing. As dusk settled over the training grounds, the recruits felt the weight of the day press into their bones, yet the older woman moved through the cool evening air, with the same deliberate precision she had maintained since sunrise, making every step appear as if carved from muscle memory older than any manual they had been given. Her performance throughout the day had been so consistently exact that even the instructors found themselves watching her with an unwilling respect, realizing that her quiet mastery had begun shaping the rhythm of the entire platoon without a single command uttered from her lips. The younger trainees whispered among themselves during brief moments of rest, grappling with the unsettling possibility that the most capable person in their company was someone they had initially dismissed as an out-of-place anomaly. During the final assessment drill, the platoon was required to assemble emergency field shelters under timed pressure, and while most struggled with the unfamiliar knots and alignment points, she completed each motion with the smooth confidence of someone who had assembled far more complex structures in far worse conditions. Her hands worked swiftly but without haste, her eyes scanning each line of tension with a precision that reminded some recruits of documentaries about elite operations conducted in hostile environments. Even the commander, who observed from a distance with arms crossed, felt a faint chill as he recognized the unmistakable discipline of someone trained to improvise under fire rather than simply follow textbook procedures. When the shelter exercise concluded, the instructors took note of her flawless score but chose not to announce it publicly, aware that drawing attention to her accomplishments might create questions they were not authorized to answer. The recruits, however, had seen everything, and the subtle shift in their behavior spoke louder than any proclamation, with several beginning to adjust their own techniques in quiet imitation of her fluid motions. Her victory carried no theatrics, no boastful grin, and no visible pride, yet the impact rippled through the platoon more powerfully than any shouted demonstration of skill could have achieved. As the group prepared for evening chow, she halted briefly near the gear depot, instinctively correcting the alignment of a support beam that had been left slightly tilted by an inattentive trainee. The correction was small, but executed with such economical precision that the nearby instructor froze midway through his reprimand, realizing she had prevented a potential collapse without waiting for permission or acknowledgement. The moment passed quickly, yet the instructor's expression lingered with a mixture of gratitude and disquiet, confirming that her instincts operated on a level beyond standard training. Inside the mess hall, the usual chatter softened as she entered, with recruits shifting subtly to give her space without ever openly admitting why. She carried her tray with the same controlled efficiency she displayed on the field, and her silence radiated through the room like a steady pulse that reshaped the atmosphere around her. Some recruits attempted small gestures of respect, stepping aside or offering her the cleaner seats, though she ignored these actions with quiet neutrality, recognizing them as reactions born of confusion rather than genuine understanding. The bully who had mocked her earlier in the day avoided her completely, sitting at the far end of the hall with shoulders tight and eyes fixed on his tray, haunted by the realization that every action he took was now measured against the memory of her calm defiance. He replayed the moment he grabbed her sleeve, remembering the cold clarity in her gaze, and the knowledge gnawed at him more painfully than any punishment the commander could have issued. His friends whispered around him, but he barely heard them, consumed by the heavy awareness that he had underestimated someone whose experience eclipsed his own existence. Later that evening, the platoon was tasked with a navigation exercise through the wooded perimeter behind the base, and although visibility was low and directions intentionally vague, she moved through the terrain with uncanny familiarity, as if every shadow and incline were old acquaintances she had learned to read long ago. Her team followed behind her, initially skeptical but increasingly dependent on her quiet cues, which guided them unerringly toward the correct checkpoints. Even in the dim light, her gait remained steady and unhurried, projecting a confidence that dissolved the fear gripping the younger trainees. The commander, monitoring progress from a vantage point, watched her team reach each objective with precision unheard of in first-week recruits, and a growing certainty settled in his chest that she possessed field instincts no ordinary soldier could display so effortlessly. He could no longer dismiss the truth he had been trying to ignore since that first glimpse of her tattoo. She had not simply returned to the training pipeline, she had descended into it, hiding a history far too significant to be contained by the walls of a boot camp. His mind raced through old reports and classified conversations, piecing together fragments of a legend that had vanished from official records decades earlier. When the exercise concluded and the platoon gathered once more under the floodlights, her face remained impassive despite the growing whispers surrounding her performance, but her stillness held a gravity that seemed to draw every eye in the formation. The instructors called out the best-performing teams, deliberately omitting her name to avoid further questions, yet the recruits already knew which group had moved, with unparalleled precision, and which figure had quietly carried them through the chaos. Her silent dominance was impossible to disguise, and her restraint in the face of recognition only amplified the aura surrounding her. As the night wind swept across the field and the recruits prepared to return to their quarters, the commander approached her with a measured step, lowering his voice as he asked whether she required any accommodations due to her age or past injuries. She shook her head once, the motion firm and unwavering, and though her answer was simple, the commander understood the deeper meaning behind it. She had endured far worse than anything they could put her through here. He nodded and stepped back, acknowledging her quiet resilience without daring to probe further. By the time the platoon was dismissed, the recruits walked away with a shared understanding that something extraordinary was unfolding in their midst, and the older woman's presence was far more than a curiosity. It was a force reshaping everything they believed about strength, discipline, and the stories carried by those who never sought recognition. And though none of them fully understood her past, they sensed that her silent victories today were merely echoes of a history that would soon reveal itself, piece by piece, whether she intended it to or not. The following morning rose with a heavy sky that felt as though it had been weighed down by everything left unsaid the previous night, and the recruits gathered on the training field with a nervous tension that settled into the air like static waiting for a spark. The older woman stepped into formation with her usual measured calm, offering no indication that anything had shifted, yet the subtle glances trailing behind her confirmed that the platoon had quietly divided into those who admired her discipline and those who feared what her presence implied. Even before the first drill began, the instructors sensed the fracture spreading, though none dared acknowledge it aloud. The commander arrived later than usual, accompanied by a stern-faced senior training officer known for his rigid adherence to hierarchy and his intolerance for anyone who disrupted established norms, especially those who challenged them quietly. His eyes scanned the formation with deliberate judgment, lingering on the woman with a thin smile that betrayed an intent far sharper than curiosity. The recruit stiffened instinctively, sensing the subtle hostility radiating from him, and even the bully who once mocked her straightened under the pressure of a man whose authority was rarely questioned. Without announcing his purpose, the senior officer strode to the center of the field and demanded a demonstration of hand-to-hand drills, insisting that the platoon observe how a proper recruit should respond under pressure. His words carried the unmistakable edge of condescension, deliberately aimed at her age and silence. Yet the woman's expression remained unreadable as she stepped forward at his command. Several recruits exchanged anxious glances, understanding that this was not instruction but an attempt to provoke her, testing whether her discipline could withstand the scrutiny of someone determined to expose weakness. He selected the strongest male trainee, a towering young man with a wrestler's build and a reputation for aggressive competitiveness, and instructed him to attack with full force under the guise of evaluating reaction time and structural integrity. The recruit hesitated briefly, aware of the imbalance, but a curt nod from the officer forced him to obey, pushing him into a role he clearly did not want to play. When he lunged forward, his movements were heavy and committed, fueled by the impossible task of proving himself against someone he already respected far more than he could admit. The moment he closed the distance, she shifted her weight with an almost imperceptible movement, redirecting his momentum so effortlessly that the trainees gasped before understanding what had occurred. She brought him to the ground with flawless control, her hands guiding him in a way that protected him even as it neutralized the threat, demonstrating a mastery that no bootcamp curriculum could replicate. The officer's jaw tightened, irritation flickering across his face as she released her hold and stepped back with the same calm composure she always carried. Unwilling to accept the outcome, he ordered her to repeat the drill, this time insisting that the trainee strike harder, faster, and without restraint, revealing his intention to push her beyond a safe threshold. The recruit protested quietly, but the officer silenced him with a single glare, and the woman accepted the order without hesitation, her stance steady and her breathing calm. When the trainee attacked again, she responded with a precise parry, redirecting his force while maintaining perfect balance, proving that strength alone could never compensate for refined instinct. Each movement she executed seemed to challenge the very authority the officer wielded, not through rebellion but through competence, so undeniable that it eroded his control with every failed attempt to undermine her. The recruits watched with a growing sense of awe and discomfort, understanding that the officer's authority was weakening in real time, eroded by the quiet power of someone who refused to flinch under pressure. Even the instructors exchanged uneasy glances, recognizing that the confrontation had crossed into something personal and potentially dangerous. Desperate to regain his dominance, the officer stepped forward himself, declaring that only a trained superior could properly test her capabilities, masking his frustration behind a facade of professionalism. The commander shifted uncomfortably, aware that the situation was escalating, but he remained silent, bound by the hierarchy that prevented him from publicly contradicting a senior. The officer removed his cap and squared his shoulders, making a point to display his rank as he circle-stepped around her, waiting for any sign of fear or hesitation. But she offered none. Her posture remained neutral, her breathing controlled, and her gaze steady, revealing nothing and concealing everything, as though she had stood before far greater threats than authority wrapped in ego. When the officer lunged forward with a rapid, precisely trained strike, she sidestepped with a motion so efficient it appeared almost premeditated, allowing his momentum to carry him past her before turning just enough to establish control without provoking escalation. The recruits held their breath, stunned by the fluidity of her reaction. While the officer struggled to mask his growing embarrassment, he attempted another attack, sharper and more aggressive, but she neutralized it with the same quiet efficiency, refusing to add force where redirection sufficed, demonstrating a restraint that only deepened the mystery surrounding her past. The younger trainees began to understand that her strength came not from defiance, but from mastery over herself, a mastery that made her immune to intimidation tactics that worked on almost everyone else. The officer stepped back, breathing unevenly, but she stood as still as a stone, neither triumphant nor apologetic. The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably across the field, forcing the officer to retreat behind protocol, muttering a thin excuse about evaluating reaction patterns under stress to salvage his dignity. The commander cleared his throat and dismissed the drill with more abruptness than usual, his voice betraying a tension he could no longer hide. The recruits slowly dispersed, whispering among themselves, now fully aware that the hierarchy they once trusted had cracked beneath the weight of a single woman who never raised her voice or claimed any title. As she returned to her place in the formation, the respect surrounding her had shifted from curiosity to something deeper, shaped not by spectacle but by quiet dominance that no challenge could erode. And although the officer walked away pretending nothing had been lost, everyone on the field knew that a new line had been drawn, one separating those who understood her worth from those still trying to deny it, even as her presence continued reshaping the power within the camp. The confrontation on the training field left a tension that clung to the base, like smoke after a controlled burn, settling into every corner where whispers traveled faster than commands. And by the next morning the air was thick with rumors that carried her name even when spoken in guarded tones. The senior officer, humiliated by his failed attempt to assert dominance, retreated into administrative shadows with a renewed determination to re-establish his authority, issuing a series of procedural changes that seemed designed less for discipline and more for creating obstacles specifically calibrated to expose her. His directives were framed as adjustments for competitive enhancement, yet the instructors recognized the unmistakable undertone of targeted suppression woven into each new rule. The older woman, however, moved through these changes with the same composed precision she applied to everything, offering no visible indication that she noticed the tightening net of scrutiny closing around her. The recruits watched carefully, sensing the unfairness in the officer's directives, but none dared speak openly, aware that challenging him directly would only worsen their situation. Instead, they observed how she adapted to each new requirement, with an instinctive understanding that seemed almost anticipatory, as though she had spent years navigating systems built to restrain her. During an equipment inspection that suddenly demanded unnecessary levels of disassembly under strict time pressure, she dismantled and reassembled the tactical gear with mechanical accuracy, her fingers moving faster than anyone in the line without exhibiting the slightest urgency. One of the drill instructors paused mid-step, realizing she was completing procedures more advanced than those taught at basic training, and the senior officer's eyes narrowed with frustration as he checked his clipboard, clearly expecting her to falter under the manufactured difficulty. Yet she neither rushed nor hesitated, revealing a depth of familiarity with equipment tolerances that surpassed the standards outlined in his own manual. Later that afternoon, he introduced an unannounced navigation test, requiring recruits to plot coordinates using outdated field maps and intentionally mismatched compasses, a task so convoluted that even the instructors exchanged bewildered looks. The recruits struggled to interpret the conflicting data, stumbling across terrain with growing confusion, while she advanced steadily as if guided by an inner compass immune to the officer's sabotage. Her steps aligned perfectly with the landscape, adjusting instinctively to slopes, tree lines, and wind patterns, revealing an experience forged in environments far more unforgiving than the controlled perimeter behind the base. Her team followed in silence, relying on the quiet certainty that radiated from her movements, and by the time they reached the final checkpoint, she had completed the task with a precision that rendered the exercise's unfair design painfully obvious. The officer remained stone-faced as she returned to formation, but a flicker of irritation rippled through him as the commander approached, silently acknowledging the inefficacy of every tactic employed to undermine her. The commander's expression, however, was not one of triumph. Instead, it carried the weight of someone piecing together fragments of a truth he wished he had never recognized. As evening approached, the senior officer summoned the instructors to a closed-door briefing, locking the room with a sharp twist that reverberated through the hallway. Inside, he delivered a sharply worded reminder of strict adherence to protocol, emphasizing that any deviation, intentional or otherwise, would be treated as insubordination. His statement was couched in bureaucratic language, yet the instructors understood the unspoken directive. Monitor her relentlessly, report anything irregular, and ensure she did not influence the recruits beyond acceptable limits. None of them spoke, but the strained posture of several revealed their discomfort with being enlisted in an effort that felt more like a political maneuver than proper training oversight. Meanwhile, the recruits gathered quietly in their barracks, exchanging theories about the sudden spike in difficulty and the officers' obsessive scrutiny, slowly realizing that the conflict had escalated beyond simple arrogance. The bully, who had initially resented her presence, now found himself defending her in hushed conversations, insisting that the system's pressure against her was unfair and increasingly suspicious. His voice carried an uneasy mixture of guilt and respect, acknowledging that her poise under relentless strain was something he could neither comprehend nor dismiss. That night, during a late inspection round, the officer discovered her reviewing outdated field manuals in the dim hallway light, and he paused before speaking, unsure whether her calm expression was intentional defiance or a silent reminder of knowledge he could not control. He demanded to know why she was studying obsolete materials, and she responded with a quiet clarity that unsettled him more than anger ever could, explaining that outdated information often revealed patterns overlooked by those relying solely on modern doctrine. Her answer was subtle yet sharp, suggesting an understanding of operational strategy that exceeded his own, and for a brief moment, he sensed the presence of a mind trained beyond the limitations of standard military pathways. He left without another word, but his footsteps carried a nervous urgency as he retreated down the corridor, recognizing that his attempt to expose her had instead exposed something far deeper within himself, fear of an authority greater than rank. The woman returned to her reading with unbroken concentration, interpreting the old maps with a familiarity that hinted at missions erased from official history, missions where individuals like her operated in places where protocol became irrelevant and survival depended entirely on instinct sharpened by necessity. When the lights finally dimmed across the barracks, the recruits lay awake longer than usual, haunted by the silent conflict unfolding above them, and they whispered about the strange certainty that the officer's hostility stemmed not from prejudice, but from recognition. They suspected he knew something they did not, something buried in classified records that did not belong in a training environment, and their imaginations filled the gaps with stories that only deepened their respect for her. The woman, however, slept peacefully, her breathing even and controlled, as though the day's pressures were nothing more than echoes of a life she had already survived. And as the base settled into uneasy quiet, a new truth began to crystallize among those who observed her closely. She was not merely surpassing the system's attempts to contain her, she was revealing the system's fear of what she had once been, and what she might still be if circumstances demanded her return. The next morning arrived with an unusual stillness, as though the base itself sensed that something significant was approaching, and the recruits gathered on the parade ground with a solemn awareness that the routine inspection would not resemble any they had experienced before. The floodlights hummed softly overhead, casting long, stark shadows that stretched across the concrete, and the crisp wind carried a weight that made even the most restless trainees stand unnaturally straight. The older woman stepped into formation with the same controlled precision she had shown every day, yet today her presence carried an almost ceremonial gravity that drew the eye of every person on the field. Word had traveled overnight that a visiting review panel from division headquarters would be observing the morning assembly, and the recruits understood that such events often exposed cracks in discipline, yet something deeper lingered in the air, a faint sense that the scrutiny would not fall on them, but on her. The senior officer arrived accompanied by two uniformed evaluators whose polished boots and immaculate insignias contrasted sharply with the dust-laden yard, and although they attempted to project authority, their glances repeatedly drifted toward the older woman with a curiosity they could not conceal. Even the commander, normally composed, appeared unsettled, shifting his weight as though bracing for a moment he could neither prevent nor fully explain. The evaluators began the inspection with formulaic questions and rigid assessments, testing each recruit's composure and readiness, but the cadence of their procedure faltered the moment they approached her. She stood perfectly still, her eyes forward and expression neutral, yet her silence radiated with a quiet force that made the evaluators pause longer than protocol required, as though they were standing before an artifact whose significance they recognized only vaguely. One of them reached for her uniform sleeve, noticing the faint outline where the fabric had once torn, and the air tightened as he requested that she reveal the area for inspection. The senior officer smirked slightly, expecting this to finally expose her. Yet the commander tensed instantly, understanding what such a request might unleash. She did not hesitate, however, and with a single steady motion, she loosened the cuff just enough for the inked lines of her tattoo to emerge beneath the morning light. The symbol, dark and unmistakable, caught the evaluators mid-breath, halting them with a shock so abrupt it rippled through the entire formation like a silent detonation. Their faces drained of color as recognition flared behind their eyes, revealing a knowledge far deeper than the recruits could possibly interpret. No one spoke, yet the silence screamed louder than any command. The evaluators exchanged a quick, alarmed glance, and the senior officer's smug expression collapsed as he realized he had triggered something far outside his control. The commander lowered his gaze for a brief moment, not in submission but in acknowledgement, as though paying respect to a memory he wished had stayed buried. The recruits shifted uneasily, trying to interpret the sudden shift in posture among the highest-ranking individuals present, and the entire field seemed to hold its breath, suspended in the moment between revelation and understanding. When the evaluators finally found their voices, they spoke with uncharacteristic restraint, asking her a deliberately vague question about her prior service, though their tone carried the reverence one reserved for figures who survive missions never meant to be spoken of. She answered with the bare minimum required, offering no embellishment and no invitation for further inquiry, yet her steady composure conveyed a deeper truth. She knew exactly what they recognized and understood the consequences of their reaction. The evaluators quickly dismissed the inquiry, hastily shifting to procedural tasks that now felt hollow and performative, revealing their discomfort with standing before someone whose past outranked their authority in ways they dared not articulate. The recruits watched the shift unfold with growing astonishment, noticing how the surrounding officers unconsciously adjusted their stance around her, creating a subtle protective perimeter, as though instinctively acknowledging an unspoken hierarchy. Even the bully, who had once belittled her without hesitation, now stared with wide, conflicted eyes, realizing that the mark on her skin represented a story far larger than any insult he had thrown. The respect forming around her was no longer the cautious admiration born from her discipline, but a deeper, instinctive reverence tied to the reactions of the very people who dictated the structure of their world. As the inspection concluded, the senior officer attempted to regain his composure, issuing several clipped orders in an effort to reassert authority. But his words carried none of the weight they once held, undermined by the evaluator's visible unease. The commander, on the other hand, stepped closer to her with a measured calm, addressing her with a tone that carried equal parts caution and respect, subtly acknowledging the shift in the power dynamic that even he could no longer contain. She responded with her usual quiet clarity, neither seizing the moment nor diminishing it, allowing the field to settle into an uneasy equilibrium shaped entirely by her silence. When the dismissed recruits dispersed across the grounds, their conversations were filled not with speculation but with a growing certainty that whatever she had once been, it was something extraordinary, something that struck fear into the hearts of seasoned officers and commanded deference from those who shaped the military's hierarchy. The older woman walked away from the parade ground with the same controlled gait she always held, yet the air around her carried a new density, as though every step echoed the weight of a past that refused to remain hidden. And though no one understood the full meaning of the tattoo she revealed beneath the cold morning light, they knew one truth with absolute certainty: the ceremony had changed everything, not through words or declarations, but through the silent acknowledgement of power that even rank could not contain. That night, long after the inspection had dissolved into hushed conversations and uneasy glances, the base lay wrapped in a cold silence, broken only by the rhythmic hum of generators that echoed faintly through the empty corridors. The older woman stood alone near the dim perimeter lights, her shadow stretching across the gravel like an old companion, and although she appeared calm, the steady tightening of her jaw betrayed the weight of memories she had fought to keep buried. The glow from the floodlights shimmered across her face, revealing a quiet resolve shaped by experiences that no training ground could ever replicate. Inside the operations building, the evaluators reviewed encrypted files with a growing sense of dread, realizing the tattoo they had seen earlier was more than a forgotten emblem. It was a mark tied to missions so deeply classified that even their clearances barely skimmed the surface. They whispered urgently about code names erased from official databases, about units that vanished without ceremony, and about reports stamped with bright red warnings, instructing readers never to speak of the contents again. The senior officer listened from across the room, attempting to mask his fear with indignation, yet even he could not ignore the tremor in his breath when the evaluators mentioned the name of a program long believed dissolved. While the officials debated quietly, the commander stepped outside into the cool night air, his gaze drifting toward the training field where she walked with slow, measured steps, as if mapping a landscape she once navigated under far harsher conditions. He knew the shape of her tattoo by heart now, and its presence scratched at his memory like an unanswered alarm, reminding him of an incident reported years earlier in a briefing he was never supposed to attend. The recollection was fractured, just a blurred image of a classified detachment returning from a mission half the world denied existed, carrying injuries that spoke of battles never recorded in military history. As he approached her, he noticed how her posture subtly shifted, revealing an awareness of his presence before he even uttered a word, and he felt a strange mixture of respect and unease settle in his chest. He asked her quietly why she had chosen to return to training after so many years away, though his tone suggested he already sensed the answer would carry far more weight than protocol should allow. She paused for a moment, her eyes fixed on the distant tree line, and when she finally spoke, her voice held the quiet steadiness of someone carefully choosing which truth could be safely released. She explained that she had returned not out of desire, but necessity, driven by the emergence of patterns she recognized from a past she had hoped would never resurface, patterns that suggested the same threat she once confronted was stirring again beneath the surface. Her words were sparse, offering no details, yet the gravity behind them sank deep into the commander's conscience, revealing a sliver of a far larger truth he feared he was not authorized to understand. The wind shifted softly as she spoke, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and distant rainfall, creating an atmosphere heavy with foreboding. The commander considered pressing for more information, but her expression made it clear that doing so would cross a boundary he was not equipped to navigate, so he simply nodded, acknowledging the unspoken weight of her decision to return. As he walked away, he felt a chill that reached far beneath his uniform, recognizing that her presence was not merely a disruption of hierarchy, but a warning of something greater approaching. His footsteps echoed against the concrete, sounding strangely hollow within the vast parade ground, as though the space itself understood the shift occurring within its boundaries. Later that night, the senior officer attempted to confront her under the pretense of clarifying procedures, but his carefully rehearsed intimidation faltered the moment. She turned toward him with a calmness that exposed the fragility of his authority. His accusations stumbled, dissolving into vague complaints about her influence over the recruits, yet each word felt thinner than the last, overshadowed by the silent knowledge that had spread across the base since the morning inspection. She listened without reacting, her steady gaze unraveling his composure until he abruptly ended the conversation, retreating with a stiffness that betrayed both anger and fear. Meanwhile, the recruits lay awake in their bunks, quietly discussing the subtle changes they had observed throughout the day, the instructor's restrained tension, the evaluator's unusually cautious demeanor, and the commander's uncharacteristic silence whenever her name surfaced. They sensed that her past was beginning to bleed through the edges of the present, illuminating cracks in the institution they had always believed impenetrable. Even the bully, who had once dismissed her without hesitation, now spoke of her with a conflicted reverence, acknowledging that her presence might be the only beacon of stability in a system shaken by secrets. Near midnight, the woman returned to the perimeter fence, tracing the worn path beneath her boots with an almost ritualistic familiarity, as though retracing steps from a place and time she had never fully escaped. The quiet hum of the floodlights blended with the distant thrum of the forest, creating a soundscape that pulled at memories she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge. For a fleeting moment, the past slipped through her composure, creating a faint flashback of dim corridors, coded transmissions, and silhouettes moving through smoke under the pressure of impossible decisions. The vision disappeared as quickly as it came, but the echo lingered within her posture, subtly tightening her shoulders as she inhaled the night air with deliberate calm. She understood that her return would not go unchallenged, and that the threat she had sensed was closer than anyone on the base realized, moving quietly beneath the veneer of protocol and order. Yet she also knew that whatever was coming, she would face it with the same relentless resolve that had carried her through missions buried deeper than the memory of those who authorized them. and as the base fell into uneasy silence once more, she stood alone beneath the dim lights, her profile carved against the night like a figure pulled from a forgotten intel report, carrying a past heavy enough to shake the foundations of every person who dared to look closely. The first shadow of the truth had finally revealed itself, and with it came the certainty that nothing about the days ahead would be ordinary. The following day began with a strange heaviness that pressed against the base like storm clouds gathering quietly beyond the horizon, and the recruits sensed something was wrong long before anyone said a word, though none of them could identify the source of the tension. The older woman noticed it the moment she stepped onto the training field, detecting a faint shift in the atmosphere, an imbalance too subtle for the untrained eye, but unmistakable to someone accustomed to reading danger in its earliest form. The crisp morning air carried an unfamiliar metallic scent, mingling with the low hum of equipment in a way that made her pause, as though listening for a signal buried beneath the surface noise. During warm-up drills, one of the instructors received a garbled radio transmission that prompted a momentary frown, yet he quickly dismissed it as interference caused by the shifting weather, though the woman's eyes lingered on the device longer than necessary. She recognized the rhythmic distortion in the signal, a pattern she had encountered in operations where outside actors attempted to mask unauthorized frequencies beneath standard communications. The commander noticed her expression and stepped closer, but before he could ask, an urgent call came from the logistics office requesting all senior personnel to report immediately, disrupting the morning routine. While the officers gathered behind closed doors, the platoon was ordered to perform perimeter sweeps along the outer training boundaries, a task normally reserved for maintenance crews rather than fresh recruits. The woman led her assigned group with steady precision, scanning each segment of the fence with a practiced eye that caught inconsistencies others walked past without noticing. She paused at a section partially obscured by dense brush, detecting a faint indentation in the soil that suggested recent activity, yet none of the recruits recalled maintenance scheduled in the area during the past week. Her fingers traced the disturbed earth gently, noting how the pattern indicated deliberate concealment rather than accidental displacement. The recruits exchanged uneasy glances as she directed them to widen their search pattern, and within minutes they discovered several loose components on a nearby junction panel, as though someone had attempted to tamper with the surveillance grid before abandoning the effort midway. The woman inspected the exposed wiring, recognizing immediately that the damage was too precise to be caused by animals or weather erosion, and a chill settled in her chest as she realized the implications. She instructed the group to report the anomaly, but her voice carried a tone of authority that made even the skeptic among them obey without hesitation. When the commander arrived with 2 engineers and a security officer, he crouched beside the panel with a grim expression, understanding that such tampering required significant technical knowledge and intentional access. The engineers confirmed her suspicion, stating that the compromised components had been loosened methodically, as though someone had attempted to bypass the motion detection system using techniques not taught at the base. The senior officer, who had accompanied the group reluctantly, attempted to dismiss the finding as routine wear, but his voice faltered as the commander produced a small, unfamiliar tool that had been wedged beneath the wiring, a device clearly not part of standard military inventory. The recruits watched as the woman studied the tool with a familiarity she chose not to explain, her expression tightening subtly as memories flickered behind her calm exterior. She recognized the design immediately, recalling a briefing from years ago involving covert infiltration methods used by rogue contractors specializing in silent perimeter breaches. The senior officer grew visibly uncomfortable as she handed the tool to the commander without saying a word, knowing that her silence carried more weight than any accusation she could voice aloud. Back at the headquarters building, the evaluators scanned the discovery with increasing unease, realizing its origin traced back to a group rumored to operate outside official jurisdiction, though any attempt to confirm this connection would require clearance levels few on the base possessed. The senior officer insisted the incident be classified as a minor security discrepancy, yet the commander refused to minimize the threat, ordering a full diagnostic sweep of all surveillance lines and motion triggers across the outer perimeter. His decision created an immediate rift between the leadership, exposing a fracture that had been widening since the moment she revealed her tattoo. Meanwhile, the woman returned to the training field with her platoon, yet her senses remained attuned to the perimeter, reading the environment like a living map, constantly shifting under an unseen hand. She moved through drills with deliberate focus, but her eyes drifted toward the tree line whenever a gust of wind cut across the yard, as though searching for a shadow that refused to stay hidden. The other recruits noticed her vigilance and felt their own unease deepen, realizing that her behavior indicated a genuine threat rather than simple caution. During a brief moment of rest, she pulled aside the bully, who now spoke to her with a respectful seriousness, and asked whether he had seen anyone lingering near the junction panel in recent days. He admitted noticing a maintenance cart parked unusually close 2 evenings earlier, but he had assumed it belonged to the night shift, though the memory now struck him as suspicious. She nodded with quiet acknowledgement, understanding that whoever had infiltrated the perimeter had likely scouted the area beforehand, testing weaknesses before attempting a deeper breach. As the day progressed, more anomalies surfaced. A locked armory door found slightly ajar despite no scheduled access, an equipment locker containing an extra flashlight unlogged in the inventory system, and a stretch of freshly disturbed gravel near a restricted generator shed. Each discovery added another piece to a puzzle the officers hesitated to confront, yet the woman recognized the pattern forming with growing clarity, her instincts aligning with a threat she had once faced under circumstances far more dire. The danger was no longer theoretical. It was already inside the system, probing for an opportunity to strike. When evening approached, the commander convened an emergency meeting with all available staff, his tone stripped of the usual authoritative confidence, replaced by a subdued resolve shaped by the discoveries of the day. He requested heightened patrols, stricter access checks, and complete transparency from every department, though his gaze kept drifting toward her with a mixture of reliance and unease. The senior officer bristled at her involvement, insisting she be excluded from strategic discussions, but the commander silenced him with a single curt remark, acknowledging that her instincts had detected the threat before anyone else. As the base settled into another uneasy night, the woman walked the perimeter once more, her boots tracing the faint outlines of the earlier disturbance, with a vigilance born from years spent waiting for ambushes hidden in ordinary darkness. The wind rustled through the trees with a sound that reminded her of distant radio static, stirring memories she tried to suppress, yet she remained steady, knowing that returning here had never been about training, it had been about timing. The threat she once confronted had resurfaced, and it had chosen this base as its next silent entry point, unaware that someone who had faced it before now stood ready to intercept its every move. And as she paused beneath the dim perimeter light, the first real tremor of the coming storm stirred the air, confirming the truth she had sensed from the beginning. The enemy was already inside the wire, and the quiet war she thought she had left behind was beginning all over again. The crisis began without warning, erupting in the middle of a routine endurance drill that had lulled the recruits into a false sense of rhythm, masking the growing tension that had simmered beneath the surface since the perimeter breach was first discovered. The older woman sensed the shift before anyone else, her attention snapping toward the distant maintenance sheds, just moments before a violent explosion shattered the quiet morning, sending a shockwave across the training field that hurled dust and debris into the rising Sunday. The recruits screamed as they dropped to the ground, scrambling for cover with the chaotic desperation of soldiers unprepared for combat, while the instructors shouted orders drowned beneath the ringing echo of impact. Within seconds, a second explosion erupted near the power junction toward the western fence, plunging several floodlights into sudden darkness and triggering a cascade of flickering alarms across the base. Smoke billowed upward in thick, twisting plumes that made the air taste like burning metal, and the sudden collapse of visibility heightened the panic rippling through the yard. The commander sprinted toward the operations building, barking directives into a barely functioning radio, while the senior officer stumbled behind him with a wide-eyed disbelief that betrayed his complete unpreparedness for a real emergency. As chaos spread across the field, the woman moved before anyone could process her decision, sprinting toward the wounded with the steady coordination of someone who had navigated far bloodier battlegrounds. She barked a single command for the nearest recruits to stay low and follow her lead, her voice cutting cleanly through the panic with a tone so sharp and authoritative that even the instructors hesitated before yielding. Her movements were swift but measured, weaving through falling debris with uncanny precision, as though every fragment of smoke and metal revealed a path invisible to untrained eyes. She reached the first injured recruit, a young man partially buried beneath shattered concrete, and without pausing she assessed the structural instability around him, lifting the heavier debris with leverage rather than force. Her hands moved with clinical certainty, identifying injuries with a glance, stabilizing his breathing with controlled pressure, and guiding 2 recruits on how to carry him without worsening the damage. The recruits followed her instructions with an obedience rooted in awe, realizing that her voice carried the unmistakable depth of battlefield experience rather than theoretical training. As she rushed toward the second blast site, a sudden flare of sparks erupted near a compromised fuel line, igniting a stream of fire that raced along the ground toward a cluster of recruits frozen in shock. She shouted a warning and lunged forward, kicking a discarded metal plank across the flaming path, with the calculated aim of someone who understood exactly how to manipulate force and trajectory under pressure. The makeshift barrier diverted the flame long enough for her to grab the nearest recruit by the collar, pulling him clear with a strength that defied her age and frame. The instructors watched in stunned silence, unable to match her speed or clarity, and several began relaying her commands rather than issuing their own, subconsciously accepting her authority amid the mounting chaos. Even the commander, returning from the operations building after failing to establish consistent comms, froze momentarily when he saw her coordinating evacuation routes with the calm efficiency of a field officer directing a real combat response. His shock deepened as he realized she was acting not on instinct alone, but with tactical foresight that indicated knowledge of the enemy's likely movements. A fresh explosion tore through the eastern shed, showering splintered wood and metal across the yard and sending a wave of recruits stumbling backward in fear. Yet the woman did not flinch. She grabbed the nearest instructor and ordered him to divert the recruits toward the southern embankment, predicting that the chain of blasts would arc north based on the initial spread pattern. The instructor hesitated for only a heartbeat before obeying, trusting her judgment over his own training, and the recruits quickly followed the new path, avoiding a secondary detonation that erupted exactly where she had anticipated. As the smoke thickened, she noticed a faint, rhythmic flicker in the distance, an almost imperceptible pattern of light near the compromised junction that did not match emergency system codes. The recognition hit her instantly, recalling covert signaling methods used by infiltration teams to coordinate movements through smoke-filled environments. She sprinted toward the flicker with a sudden urgency that startled even the commander, understanding that the crisis was not merely sabotage but the opening phase of a deeper incursion designed to destabilize the base. Halfway there, she spotted another injured recruit pinned beneath a collapsed beam, and with a moment of hesitation that lasted no longer than a breath, she altered her path to reach him first. The beam was heavy and dangerously angled, threatening to shift and crush him entirely, but she positioned her hands with a confidence shaped by years of extracting teammates under fire. She instructed 2 nearby trainees to brace the beam with their legs, while she leveraged her shoulder beneath the heaviest point, lifting just enough for the trapped recruit to crawl free. Her muscles trembled, yet her face remained controlled, betraying none of the strain coursing through her body. The freed recruit gasped in shock as she guided him away from the unstable debris, and his voice cracked as he whispered a quiet, "Thank you," though she dismissed the gratitude with a brief nod, already scanning the field for the next threat. The commander reached her side at last, breathless and pale, demanding to know how she had predicted the blast pattern and located the hidden signal, but she silenced him with a single look, calm, steady, and heavy with the weight of knowledge he was not cleared to hear. He recognized the meaning instantly, stepping back with a conflicted mixture of trust and fear, understanding that she was operating on a level far beyond the scope of conventional command. As the alarms finally stabilized and emergency crews began flooding the field, the recruits gathered near the embankment, watching her with expressions filled with awe, confusion, and a dawning realization that they had witnessed something far greater than simple bravery. They had seen her move through the chaos, with the precision of a legend, unshaken, unwavering, and terrifyingly prepared for a threat none of them had recognized, until it was already bearing down upon them. And as the smoke slowly cleared across the devastated training grounds, one truth became impossible to ignore. The woman they had once mocked had just prevented a catastrophe through instincts, honed in battles the world would never acknowledge, revealing a fraction of the power she had fought desperately to keep hidden. The investigation began before dawn, as teams of security officers descended upon the damaged sections of the base, with an urgency that betrayed their fear of what might still be hidden beneath the smoke. The older woman stood quietly on the edge of the rubble, watching engineers sift through twisted metal with movements too careful to be routine, and although she appeared calm, her eyes registered every detail with a precision that unsettled even the seasoned specialists nearby. The commander approached her with visible hesitation, explaining that headquarters had demanded her presence for questioning, yet his tone carried a reluctant respect shaped by everything he had witnessed only hours earlier. She followed him across the dimly lit yard, her steps steady despite the exhaustion woven deep into her muscles, and the recruits watched in a reverent silence that contrasted sharply with the chaos from the previous day. Some whispered among themselves, trying to reconcile the woman they had once mocked with the figure who had moved through explosions as if born from the smoke, while others simply stared, recognizing a level of composure no training manual could teach. Even the bully found himself standing straighter as she passed, his expression filled with a mixture of gratitude and guilt he could not put into words. Inside the operations building, the air felt tight and stale, vibrating faintly with the tension of officers scrambling to piece together a coherent narrative from fragments of sabotage, malfunctioning systems, and unexplained signals. She was led to a stark briefing room, where a panel of senior officials waited with expressions carefully arranged to convey authority, though the subtle stiffness in their posture betrayed their apprehension. The senior officer who had opposed her since her arrival sat among them, and his eyes glinted with a mixture of bitterness and unease, unable to fully disguise how deeply the previous day's events had shaken him. The questioning began politely enough, with inquiries about her movements during the drills, her observations on the field, and her interpretation of the tampered equipment. But each answer she offered precise, concise, and devoid of embellishment only deepened their discomfort. The officials exchanged uneasy glances, recognizing that her assessments carried an expertise far beyond that of a typical recruit, revealing knowledge of infiltration tactics, blast dispersion patterns, and counter-surveillance sequencing normally reserved for elite operatives. The senior officer attempted to interject with accusations disguised as procedural clarifications, yet each time she responded with quiet clarity that exposed the hollowness of his claims. As the questions grew sharper, the atmosphere shifted from uneasy curiosity to thinly veiled fear, and the panel pressed her about her prior service record, seeking confirmation of rumors that had begun to spread across the base. She remained composed, offering only the information required by regulation, refusing to elaborate on assignments sealed behind classification levels none of them possessed. Her restraint carried the weight of someone who understood the dangerous boundary between truth and secrecy, and the officials sensed they were navigating territory far outside their authority. The commander, seated at the edge of the room, watched the exchange with growing discomfort, recognizing the unfairness of interrogating the very person who had prevented a catastrophic loss of life. He intervened gently but firmly, reminding the panel that her actions during the crisis had been decisive and instrumental in stabilizing the situation, and that questioning her judgment without fully understanding the threat risked undermining the base's readiness. His words carried a quiet conviction that silenced the room, revealing the depth of his respect for her despite the rank that separated them. Outside the briefing room, the recruits gathered in small clusters near the barracks, exchanging fragments of information they had overheard from instructors, too shaken to maintain their usual composure. Some speculated that she was part of a legendary unit whispered about in old stories, while others believed she had returned to uncover a threat known only to a handful of high-ranking officials. Their voices carried a mixture of fear and admiration, recognizing that the explosions had been more than sabotage, they had been a test, and she had been the only one who understood the rules. Meanwhile, the engineering teams uncovered additional evidence near the damaged junction, deliberate bypasses hidden inside structural beams, and footprints leading toward restricted zones that suggested the infiltrators had moved through the shadows with purpose. Each discovery reinforced her earlier warnings, confirming that the threat had been far more sophisticated than the officers initially admitted, and the realization spread rapidly through the command structure. The senior officer's attempts to downplay the incident crumbled under mounting proof, leaving him exposed as someone more concerned with preserving pride than protecting the base. Back in the briefing room, the officials pressed her about how she had predicted the secondary detonations and identified the covert signals amid the chaos. But she answered with the same quiet restraint, refusing to reveal the depth of training that had shaped her instincts. The senior officer attempted one final challenge, accusing her of withholding information, yet the evaluators quickly overruled him, recognizing that pressing further risked compromising classified boundaries they were not cleared to cross. Their posture shifted subtly, displaying a respectful distance normally reserved for officers with decades more experience. When the questioning concluded, the commander escorted her out of the room with a solemn expression, pausing in the hallway to thank her with a sincerity that surpassed formal gratitude, acknowledging privately that her presence had prevented a tragedy none of them could fully comprehend. She nodded in response, offering only a brief acknowledgement. Yet the weight behind her gaze revealed that she understood far more about the situation than she could safely share. The commander hesitated before asking whether the infiltrators would strike again, but she answered only with a faint, knowing silence that carried more truth than any spoken words. As she stepped outside, the recruits straightened instinctively, their conversations halting as though a superior officer had entered the yard, and their eyes followed her with a mixture of reverence and quiet determination. They no longer saw an older woman struggling through bootcamp. They saw the figure who had stood against fire and fear without hesitation, guiding them through chaos with a steadiness they could barely fathom. And as the sun rose over the damaged base, illuminating the scars left by the explosions, one truth settled across the grounds with undeniable force. Whatever threat loomed beyond the fences, she was the only one prepared to face it, and the entire unit now understood that her presence was not a coincidence, but a warning the world had not yet learned to hear. By the time the sun dipped low across the horizon, the base had begun to settle into a tense quiet, with officers moving briskly through the corridors as though trying to outrun the truth that had finally cornered them. The older woman stood alone near the edge of the parade ground, her silhouette framed by the fading amber light, carrying herself with the steady composure of someone who had survived storms far heavier than the chaos of the past 2 days. The commander approached with a mixture of resolve and hesitation, knowing that the moment ahead would define more than just her place in the boot camp. It would reshape everything the unit believed about duty and honor. He informed her that headquarters had reviewed the evidence, confirmed the infiltration, and traced the tools found on site to a group operating outside all known channels, a group she had once faced during missions sealed behind layers of classified silence. His voice softened as he admitted that her presence had not been an accident or a bureaucratic oversight, but a deliberate recall prompted by signatures in the intercepted signals, signatures only she could recognize with absolute certainty. She listened quietly, her eyes reflecting the dusk, understanding now that the threat had grown bold enough to force the system into revealing what it once buried. A sudden call over the loudspeaker summoned all recruits and instructors to the parade ground for an emergency assembly, and within minutes the yard filled with rows of fatigues, boots aligned in neat but anxious formation. The senior officer stood stiffly at the front, clearly uncomfortable with the gathering but unable to stop it, while the evaluators lingered to the side, their postures firm yet respectful. When she stepped forward beside the commander, the murmurs rippled through the ranks like a controlled shock, and the recruits straightened instinctively, recognizing the gravity of the moment without understanding its full weight. The commander addressed the formation with a solemn clarity, explaining that the explosions had been part of a coordinated infiltration attempt, and that the woman they once believed to be just another late-entry recruit had, in fact, prevented catastrophic loss of life through experience none of them possessed. Each carefully chosen word chipped away at the final layer of doubt, revealing the truth they had sensed but never spoken aloud. She had belonged to a unit known only through whispers, a group deployed when missions demanded silence, precision, and the acceptance that survival itself was never guaranteed. Though he did not name the unit, the hush that settled over the yard confirmed that every listener understood the magnitude of what had been acknowledged. She stepped forward then, not with grandeur or theatrics, but with the same quiet strength she carried through every drill, and for a moment the yard held its breath, waiting for the kind of speech heroes give in stories. Instead, she offered only a simple acknowledgement, explaining that she had returned because danger rarely announces itself clearly, and because duty does not fade simply because time has passed. Her voice remained soft, yet carried across the assembled ranks with undeniable force, reminding them that courage often lives not in glory, but in the quiet decision to stand where others step back. The bully lowered his gaze, overwhelmed by the realization that the woman he had mocked had saved his life without hesitation, and the recruits beside him shifted uncomfortably, wrestling with the humility that comes when arrogance is stripped bare by truth. The instructors bowed their heads slightly, recognizing the honor of having trained beside someone whose legacy extended far beyond the boundaries of any manual. Even the senior officer, whose pride had driven him to undermine her, could not fully raise his eyes, confronted by a level of integrity he had tried desperately to diminish. The commander concluded the assembly by stating that an elite response team would arrive within days, but until then the base would remain under heightened alert, with her serving as an advisor rather than a trainee. The announcement resonated through the ranks, confirming that the hierarchy had shifted irreversibly, shaped not by rank but by merit carved through years of unspoken sacrifice. She accepted quietly, neither proud nor hesitant, understanding that her return was not an honor but a responsibility she had long carried without expectation of recognition. As the formation dismissed, the recruits turned toward her with a unified respect, not forged from fear or rumor, but earned through the undeniable truth of her actions, and for the first time since her arrival, she allowed a faint, weary breath to escape, almost a sigh, almost a release. The night